Hello, everyone, and welcome to the modcast. Today, I have Zeus Yiamouyiannis with me, founder and chief operator of CitizenZeus.com. Dr. Zeus is also a learning activist. His experience has convinced him of the importance of deinstitutionalizing learning and democratizing access to the power of learning. Beyond the degrees and titles, Zeus sees learning versus mere education as a birthright to be engaged as adaptive, creative, rigorous engagement with the world and other people. Dr. Zeus's mission is to engage learning from an authentic place in you to successfully embrace authentic challenges and opportunities in and beyond the world. Zeus, thank you so much for joining me in the modcast. We spoke briefly the other day, and you have lots of interest, really. You have lots of views with regards to the current conflict. And let's
Mm.
start a little bit more about your background and what you do exactly and what led you to writing and providing more info on Citizen Zeus.
Well, I've always been an unconventional person. My father was involved as a biochemist in the fight against fluoride, which is now coming into a court case, and now he's being proven out pretty well on that. We've always brought really unusual people to our house, people at the front cutting edge of the health movement and the consumer rights movement. And so I was born and raised on an organic farm in central Ohio. Um, a father who used to work for an institution, a research institution, chemical abstracts in Columbus, Ohio. Then he went off on his own when he found some kind of integrity issues there. So I've always been from a critical and creative mind. And having grown up on an organic farm, very close to nature, very spiritually oriented as well. And I just learned that I love to learn and I love to understand how learning happened. And that led me to critically engage propaganda for a time, do a dissertation on self-esteem and self-identity and self-worth as a graduate student at Syracuse University in an interdisciplinary program where my degree was philosophy of education, a PhD in philosophy of education. And then after that, I really got involved in spirituality pretty strongly. I studied pretty intensively for a year and a half on Kabbalah, the Jewish mysticism. I was at a Christian seminary for a year and a half, two Christian seminaries for a year and a half. That's another story, but and engaged in hermetics and esoteric teachings for about 3 years there as well. So I have a consuming interest on the nature of reality with a capital R, and with how we use worldly mechanisms to distort that larger spiritual reality. And that's why learning is really so important. The introduction is apropos, because if we can learn how we learn and we can learn how we are being indoctrinated, and if we can be rigorous, and that was part of the description, rigorous in terms of the attunement with reality, empirical and physical reality, moral reality on the ground, then I think that we have more than a small chance to help advance the human race and bring us into a greater state of enlightenment and togetherness in which all religions are respected, spiritual beliefs, the best rise to the top, and the darker, more subterranean ones are called out. And I do this with a sense of compassion, even for my so-called enemy. I do believe in loving your enemy. I do believe that it is the greatest thing you can do for your enemy to use love to call them out if they are sinning or murdering or deceiving. And so that's the attitude I come with.
Very interesting. Firstly, so interesting with the connection really with nature, firstly, and how sometimes it makes you really wonder and think. And we live in a day and age where people are unaware about the level of addiction they have for technology. And it's also interesting how you're describing the perspective of openness when it comes to being like religious and open at the same time. Like I consider myself to be a religious person, and I firmly believe, like my religion, particularly Islam, it's about being open, right? Reaching towards other people. I mean, we learn from day one, from the ABCs, really, in religion, how God made people different different tribes and different people so they can learn from one another and get to know one another. Yet you're constantly met with this really approach from mostly elites and governments, really, and in mainstream media. You wouldn't hear them talking about what you're talking about, love. You wouldn't hear them talking about openness. You wouldn't hear them talking about the respect. It's all the opposite of what you're saying. How
Right.
do you think we're able to reach such things and implement them at a day and age where you have so much fierce hate provoking and division provoking mainstream media and people in power?
Well, this is, very biblical in many ways. It's very spiritual in many ways. I mean, they call Satan the deceiver, right? Or the adversary. So you have to treat like a noble adversary. I try to treat everyone as a noble adversary, including even Satan. And there's a basic spiritual principle that is total, and that is God. And that's why it's important to be open-hearted, right? And open-minded. And Jesus talked about hard-heartedness being one of the greatest sins, right? And it's when you can no longer be empathetic to the murder of children, you've got a more than a small problem. So what's happening, I think, is that people who are experimenting with trying to put worldly power over heavenly or spiritual power. And there's a big problem with that. There's a fundamental metaphysical problem. It can't create. It can't love. It can't provide energy. It can only suck it up, right? It can only attract adherents and loyalists. It can only attract attention and use algorithms on computers to focus people's energy. As we develop a critical and creative and spiritual capacity to discern between forces which are parasitic in nature, which are worldly forces, okay, including these institutions. They are very highly developed technologies. I'm not underestimating them. But at the fundamental ontological, that is reality-based root, they cannot create, they cannot produce energy because they do not open their minds and their hearts to God. They do not, and I'm not talking about God in necessarily religious God, but I'm talking about spirit, the human spirit, that which is eternal, that which love comes from, right? And if you don't do that, you cannot be a light. You cannot be enlightened. You cannot illuminate and radiate that wonderful energy into the world. And therefore you need, you're panicked, you're insecure. You need to attract it and you need to eat it from other people. And if we can develop that one discernment capability, we'll go a very long way. And using our critical mind as well as our intuition and our hearts, we'll go a long way to beginning to defeat the adversary.
So it's not all about just getting millions and having cars and houses. It's not about that.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I also find it very difficult nowadays, especially with certain lifestyles and parameters of success being promoted as well. Like when you talk about someone, and they even call it the net worth. What's someone's net worth, right?
Yeah.
So they calculate the net worth by the amount of assets you have, how much cash you have in the bank, how many businesses you have, how many properties you own. Nothing in terms of net worth, right? And they don't even call it financial net worth, just net worth.
Right.
Includes your service for humanity, your morals, your ethics, anything of the sort. So you're really facing the whole narrative that's being pushed through movies, through Hollywood, through mainstream media as well, which I find really it's important to challenge it and provide the counter argument for it in terms of fulfillment, spiritual fulfillment, and physical fulfillment as well. One thing that we spoke about previously that I found very interesting in your writings and your line of thinking, you said you learned about Kabbalah, and you mentioned about the different definitions of God and Judaism. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, but I wanted to pick up on what you just said real quick to
Sure.
affirm that, because I've seen the same thing in media. They talk about high value mate. I'm thinking about
Yeah.
not only a high quality mate, but in the end, I say, how about a high virtue mate?
Mm.
Right. So, in Kabbalah, it's interesting. I mean, I went through the Philip Berg kind of school. I was in the Philippines at the time, and they had a thing over there. Looking at more the ancient texts of Kabbalah, and I'm thinking here of Yehuda Ashlag and the 10 luminous emanations, which I consider to be quite mature. Some of the more modern forms I don't consider as mature. But the notion that they had with regard to this, and the reason why I kind of stopped studying with that, was it was too much focus on merit, right? And in the Christian tradition, there's a lot more focus on grace, right?
Mm.
Merit is the more exoteric way. That's like you're reaching for the heaven, right? And there is merit to merit. I mean, discipline, character, ritual. I mean, in Islam, there's, there are these various things to help create a structure. So I do understand that there is merit, and that merit has a place. But the thing that really consumes me, and I find the most intriguing, is this notion of me being active by being actively receptive, right? To God, to spirit, to inspiration, and to be courageous in that. Because when I get these insights downloaded, and all my writing pretty much comes through me, I don't pretend to I take responsibility for the written things that I've written, because that's my responsibility. But from where those things came from and the inspiration is in fact spiritual. It doesn't come from my mind. It comes through my mind. It doesn't even come from my heart, but it comes through my heart. And so to me, I found the mystic aspects of Kabbalah quite engaging. Even scanning the Hebrew text, I could feel the power of those words coming off the page to me. And again, it comes to this notion of being open, right? Being open-hearted, being open-minded, and to feel power as it's coming through you or to you. And that's, I think that's what my spiritual practice is. That's where its connection to nature is for me too, because that's where I found it as a little boy. I went out, I spoke to the spirits in the woods. I felt the power. I still hug trees today because I can feel the energy coming up through. I can feel wisdom. I feel intelligence. I feel that the witness that tree has had for hundreds of years, these bigger trees. So again, everything to me, and this is the mystical tradition across all of them, Kabbalah, Sufi, Mahayana Buddhism, Christian mysticism, and Sikhism would probably be the equivalent in Hindu. And that is this notion of unity with God. And God not understood as some kind of authoritarian being, but God understood as...
Or a servant.
Or a servant, as it turns out with a lot of these
or
religions.
An estate agent.
Yes, yes, and that's really important, because to honor God first and foremost is to open oneself completely with God and to desire unity with that God. And the different religious traditions, I find that they happen well from my personal character, through mystic traditions, but I really respect the ways in which it happens in the various traditions. And I do attend a church, and I love the people in the church, even though we don't have the exact same, like you said, orientation. We are different, but that differentness points us back to this wonderful spiritual birthplace. And that should be, a reason for celebration.
Yes. Yeah, many people, and it's a wonderful approach, to be honest with you. Because many people, when you talk about religion specifically, many people have the notion that they need to agree with you on everything, right? That we need to be on the same page, even when it comes to interpretation. Like if you'll have a slightly different interpretation, that can cause a lot of frictions. And I believe that this understanding has been created from the top and went down to the bottom. Like I believe, for example, in the Muslim world, lots of it has come from the approach of, at many points in history, not all points of history, oppressive approach from the top, either my way or the highway. I'm the ruler, you need to listen to me. And then there's one very notable scholar who عبد الرحمن الكواكبي, his name is, and he wrote a book called طبائع الاستبداد ومصارع الاستعباد, which is basically the struggle against oppression and the roots of oppression and authoritarianism. And many people in the Arab world, he wrote it in the beginning of the 20th century, after about 19 years of studies. And he's studied Western democracies, Eastern democracies. And in his book, he described how this authoritarianism reaches the population, really, and how governments behave. And even when we talk about democracy nowadays, like we're seeing so much double standards and hypocrisy when it comes to the talk about democracy. Like when you talk about Western democracy, you have so many values that are in theory very nice, right? But I think people forget that our ancestors fought for these values. They weren't granted, really, and that people in power constantly try and take it away from you. And it's very crucial for people to be awake to that fact. Because when you talk about democracy, for example, look at the situation in the Middle East and how many, for example, governments that are authoritarian have very good relationships with some countries in Western countries who call themselves democracies. And seriously, we constantly ask, are we living under elected dictatorships or democracies? So you're kind of facing multiple powers, really, when you talk about this open approach. You're talking about a government who constantly wants to suppress these things, and in theory, giving you good ideas, they're giving you beautiful slogans, yet they're implementing something that is the complete opposite to control the population. And the recent, obviously, genocide that's happening in Gaza is highlighting this further for many people. And I mean, as a Palestinian, you're aware of these things from a very young age because you're born into a conflict, really, that you have to know more about, and you see throughout your lifetime the double standards and the hypocrisy as to how the mainstream media portrays things, how international law, for example, doesn't necessarily exist. What's your take on what's happening at the moment and how it's being portrayed in Gaza, particularly?
Well, it's an amazing, eye-opening, fascinating, and galling spectacle. And I mean, it's really important. I really appreciate what you talk about martyrs, because truly, you know, it's, in terms of spiritual development and human development, these Palestinians who are being murdered are martyrs. They are sacrificing themselves for our advancement, and our major responsibility is to acknowledge that lesson and acknowledge that sacrifice, and to do everything we can to learn as deeply and spiritually and practically as we can to engage what's now being thrown against us, because it's easy to get drawn into trauma, right? It's easily to just see the sickening and want to turn away. And it takes a courageous heart to actually engage. And, you know, I want to tie that into with what you just said. Jesus said, if they are not against us, then they're with us. George Bush said, if they're not with us, they're against us.
Yeah.
Right. We're with the terrorists. So these are the two mottos of the top down, which are the darker forces, let's face it, and the bottom up that comes through our spirit. Okay. Difference is a miracle. Difference was created by God to allow us to learn and to disperse that love and disperse that spirit in so many forms, creative forms. So I have always used the motto, desire difference, right? I actually affirmatively desire it. I'm not trying to mollify it. This is the liberal disease, right? They still have a suspicion of difference, but how can't we all get along? And authoritarian conservatism says just extirpate the difference, right? And that's what you're seeing right now. You're seeing a mentality that was given birth, unfortunately, in the Torah, in Deuteronomy, and so forth, which said intermarrying between tribes was consorting with evil, right? In which a jealous God called Yahweh said, I'm going to give you the power to conquer. In fact, give you a sacred commandment to wipe them out, every man, woman, and child. And even Elisha in the Bible, when he was teased for being called Baldy by these 42 boys, he calls these bears to come in to rip them limb from limb. So it's even children aren't allowed outside of this. So you see an incredibly intolerant, fundamentalist, monolithic understanding of power and of righteousness, which basically says we're the chosen people, all else must bow before us. They've even had rabbis do that, talking about others serving, their role is to be of serving the chosen. And the exact opposite of that is what I see. What I see by the success of the Palestinians, and it is not a small success, and it is a moral and spiritual victory that they are engendering right now by not giving in and giving up on the land, by using the resourcefulness that was trained into them by the persecution they experienced for 75 years to show the world in no uncertain terms that the spirit is more powerful than anything that can be thrown against them. And that's what I see happening right now. From the actual military operations, it's clear that the Palestinians are winning, that Hamas has greater success and greater inventiveness and resourcefulness, not unlike the American Revolution. They're using their terrain and their humble stuff to achieve surprising victories. But there's a greater message that's coming out here, and that is that Palestinians are rallying the entire world's population, and we're seeing a realignment. The adversary was dividing us up by race and identity, and now that's beginning to collapse thanks to the courage, moral courage, and spiritual courage of the Palestinians, where they're saying we have been put upon. And they're some of the oldest souls. Palestinians I know are some of the wisest, oldest souls. And I have never seen a person who's ever gone into Palestine or been over to a Palestinian person's house who hasn't said, this is the most generous, hospitable environment I've ever been in. There's this tangible hospitableness, this tangible welcoming that is almost supernatural, right? People
I must
notice
agree with
it.
you.
Yeah, I mean, every person says, there's a great story with my separated spouse. She had gone over there and there was a woman who was Jewish and she was paranoid, right? Because they're taught how to be that way and they think she's going to be killed. And when she finally did take the time to come over into Palestinian home, she was so amazed by the embracing love experience there and generosity that she ended up dating a Palestinian man after that.
I'm not surprised.
And she contrasted that to the backbiting, because some people think that Israelis are united in their hatred, or at least in their purpose, but this is not true. Ask Israelis. They'll say some of the greatest hate I experiences from other Israelis, because when you create this chosen person, not with me, against me mentality, and even within that say, well, you can't ever really make it up to my level, you're still going to be subservient to me, you create a hell. You create a hell of your own making. And that creates a thirst in you, almost a vampiric type of thirst. And the only way that can be slaked is through vengeance, or through conquering, or through wiping out that difference, or judging someone else and rationalizing ways to abuse them or exploit them or oppress them. And that's what's underneath the oppressor mentality, a tremendous insecurity, a tremendous hunger, because the methods that you're using, even if you have multi-million-dollar houses and cars and planes and nice clubs to go to and so forth, and illegal settlements that you set up with swimming pools, that is empty. And your soul knows it. And you resent that because you put so much into it, psychological sunk cost. and you're too prideful to admit that this is never going to get it. So you try it again, and you try to blame it, you try to externalize it, but it's not going to happen. The witness that Palestinian people are putting is that the spirit holds, right? And even, I think if you mentioned this, a lot of the more orthodox Judaic scholars, teachers, and rabbis are against Zionism and against this thing because they say it's against what the Bible is saying. You don't have the power to militarily, especially if you're an atheist, establish a Jewish state that is, religious or spiritual in nature, and to do so is idolatry. And it's, it's a great insult to God. So that's where we're at right now. I think that, I'm looking at, what was her name? Dunia Abu Mohsen. She was the girl whose family was killed in one of these bombing attacks, and she had to be amputated. And remember, she was in the hospital, and she gave interviews in that hospital. She was still sunny. You could see her face was still radiant. She said, "I want to be a doctor and work with people with prosthetics." And then she was targeted, I think. She was killed in the hospital by a tank shell. I think that they deliberately targeted her for two reasons. One, she was great for anti-propaganda, right? For their cause. In other words, she was very sympathetic, and I think they wanted to remove her. But I think there's a deeper spiritual reason why they wanted to remove her. I think she showed them up. She showed with her radiance and that thing coming out of her heart, and you could see its earnestness, and you could feel it if you watched interviews with her. I think they wanted to extinguish that because they saw the power of it, and they did not want it to exist.
I think they're being very frustrated, to be fair, because they're seeing that from all of the population. They genuinely thought that by the initial barbaric massacre, indiscriminate, full of vengeance, vengeful, hateful massacre that is deliberate and well calculated, by the way, that they're able to kill that spirit. They're continuing the starvation attempt to kill that spirit. They killed over 130 journalists, 129 families in Gaza, whole families are wiped off, have been wiped off. Some families have over 100 members, right? So, like you said, they don't want this mentality to continue, and they're fighting it with every way possible. But it's not working. It's not working, which is frustrating them even more. And now it's like they're in defiance with everyone, including the US, right?
Yeah.
Despite all of our criticism about the US and the fact that it's the enabler, the US administration of all of this. But you're reaching a stage where they're forcing themselves as an untenable entity, right? Or a pariah state, and think they can get away with it. But the Palestinian people show them day after day that it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen, really, because there's so much they can handle, and they know the history very well. It's like these people who persisted in the northern parts of Gaza, for example. Why anyone with a sound mind really would think, why on earth would you want to stay in a location when you know that these people are deliberately trying to starve you to death? Like the targeting of people when they go to the trucks of aid, right? Bombing them when they're getting aid. Imagine what level of evil can do that, really. And they've done that dozens of times, telling people that place is safe, and then they'd go and bomb it. It's because the people who are in the north, they are descendants of the same refugees who were expelled from their homes in 1948. And the message that they're sending to Israel is, we know what you're up to, and we would rather die on our land than leave it to you, because we don't trust you to get us back to where we were. And the funny thing is, the ironic thing really, is that I find what Israel is trying to inflict on the population of Gaza, this vengeful, racist, supremacist approach, and all of this oppression to create this defeated mentality, it's as if it's hitting them straight back.
Yeah.
More and more Israelis are questioning, how valid is our country. Many people think Zionism is dead, including great thinkers, analysts you hear in many Israeli newspapers. People from the intelligence community telling you, we're done if we continue down this path, really. Yet you see this man who has many traits of psychopathy, really, and narcissism, Netanyahu, continuing somewhat with impunity.
Right.
I mean, all we have is lip service, really.
Right.
And this brings more responsibility for people like us, particularly in Western countries, from all backgrounds, to continue. Which leads me to my next question. How do you find the shift in Western countries and populations primarily when it comes to Gaza and Palestine and Israel? What's your take on that?
Well, I think what's happening is the Hezbollah, you can see declining empires both in America and I think the Western colonial settler project in general has been marked by entitlement, monopoly, and incompetence and a hollowed out morality to the point where they've gotten really soft, right? Not soft in their military tactics. They've gotten harder in that, but they've got soft in thinking that whatever they say, whatever they do will just automatically be accepted. And now with all these contradictions that are coming out, the UNRWA funding that was cut off, right? And it turns out, well, they tried to torture confessions out of a few employees, right?
Yeah.
And they're saying, well, there was all these rapes and babies and so forth. And what you see is the exact opposite. So now Western cultures, even people that are on the street, are realizing that every accusation is a confession. Literally every accusation that these Israelis have made have been shown to, it's now been proven with evidence that they are doing it. They are torturing their prisoners. They are killing babies in those incubators, right? They're the ones raping and doing sexual assaults on women and even on children in their prisons, which they're detaining administratively without any charge. So the truth is beginning to get out. And it's beginning to strain things. And it's not just the political reality for Joe Biden. There is a palpable moral and spiritual force that is building up as a result of these contradictions that are beginning not just to turn public opinion, but to turn hearts. We're in a little bit of an in-between space because people don't know what to do with that, right? They could be like me. I've donated probably now about $600 or $700 to Palestinian aid and Doctors Without Borders and all kinds of things. Just to help. And I, obviously on my Substack on Citizen Zeus, I've called out my Christian fellow people. But I think that's where we're at right now, especially Christians. I know both liberal and conservative are both been brought into kind of gold into and propagandized into supporting Israel. But now they're beginning to rebel a bit as well, right? They're sensing it. A lot of them are trying to distance themselves from it. But they're no longer, the gravity is starting to pull them in.
Yeah.
Now I think the big question is, what are we going to do, given that these governments in the billionaire class and this sort of global, I won't call them elite, I'll call them caste, this global upper caste has networked so well. The question is, what are we going to do?
How much do you think the Christian support, particularly for Israel, is authentic religiously from a religious belief, or is it more artificial, primarily following the establishment of Zionism and this promotion of the notion that these are the chosen people, or, for example, from the evangelical perspective and the belief that the Jews being there and having more chaos will make it quicker for the return of the Messiah according to their belief? How much is it authentic and how much is it really made up and artificial? And what does Zionism have to do with it?
Well, it's all made up. I mean, the whole Schofield Bible, the whole anti-Islamic orientation was cultivated since the early 1900s, right? To tie Christians to supporting Israel as a state, but also Judaism, certain forms of Zionist Judaism. That's kind of a contradiction in terms, but we'll just, there are some, you know what I mean? Okay. To where they're trying to marry the state, you know, with the religion. And Christianity has had that problem too back in Constantine's era. But what's happening now, and so what they basically did was say, okay, you're correct. The road goes through Israel. Israel has to be completely supported in order for the second coming to happen or for the next temple. Now, in Jesus's lexicon, my body is the temple. So the second temple is, you know, the third temple has already been created within Christianity, but people don't know that. So what's happening is that people find this whole notion of a Judeo-Christian tradition itself is a
lie.
It's a lie. Yahweh, the jealous God, the God of war, is exactly opposite of Jesus, the Prince of Peace. Blessed are the poor and the meek. Okay, you couldn't get, I mean, Jesus might be the right hand and, you know, Yahweh may be the left hand, but these are not, in my lexicon, compatible with each other in terms of, you know, which one you follow. You follow that God is love, if you're a Christian, or you follow God as violence, hatred toward others, and you're not with me, you're against me kind of mentality. That's how I go at it. What's kept other Christians from realizing how different the red letters are that Jesus's teachings and example are from these others is this top-down approach where they feel their salvation is tied and the second coming is tied to this unbiblical notion of revelations or interpretation of revelations that was stimulated by Zionism. And it's completely at odds with Zionism. I mean, part of what's waking people up is you have people like Ben Shapiro saying Jesus Christ was a common criminal and he deserved what he got. And then you had another rabbi saying Jesus, Mother Mary, Virgin Mary, was a prostitute, was a whore, but out of wedlock birth. And you contrast to what Muslims say about Christianity.
Peace be upon him. And,
peace be upon him, accepted as Messiah. And the heavy emphasis on virtue and high living and healthy living.
Absolutely.
Instead of this profligate, you know, materialist, fame-seeking mentality.
Well, one funny thing that I wanted to mention is actually the British government, you know, they're having this new definition of extremism. And one of the lawyers that took the case to defend the people who are being blamed for extremism, he brought out something very interesting. He told them, based on the current government's description of extremism, Jesus Christ himself would have been an extremist. Aristotle would have been an extremist, right? Which just highlights really how detached they are from reality, from the teachings of religion, and even from the values that they preach. Like, for example, again, in Britain here, there's lots of talk about British values, which in essence are good values. Democracy, respecting other people, regardless of their background, their religious background, their ethnical background, their racial background, being tolerant and respectful to different opinions. Yet you have people in power doing the exact opposite. Exact opposite. They're spreading hate between people. They're spreading division between people. They will claim that they're protecting some sort of an ideology or whatever, and they're working completely against it. So it's very crucial to highlight these things, to make people aware about the fact that these people who are coming up with these labels of they are the extremists.
Mhm.
Yet they try and take the position of, I'm telling you, you're in no position to tell me or to define
Right.
extremism. I haven't seen anything noble from you
Mhm.
or any sort of moral virtue
Mhm.
proven, right, for
Mhm.
you to come and lecture me.
Right.
And what I constantly reiterate as well, because I obviously, my position as a Palestinian who was born in Israel, really, lets you see both sides of the picture to an extent,
Mhm.
right? I'll obviously call a spade a spade. I'll tell you things as they are. But when you get sources from Arabic language, Hebrew language, English language, you try and get a bigger picture of what's happening. But many people in very intense conflicts, such as this one, they find it difficult to um, be emotionally restrained. And I'm not saying completely restrain your emotions, but what I always call for is for people to still have their anger in check, because this is what they thrive on: making you angry, lose it, not being able to discuss anything, and just babble and shout, really. Not to say again that, people should suppress their emotions. No, I think emotions are a very healthy thing.
Mhm.
But I think it's very important to have regulated emotions and not be attracted to the same approach that the opposite side is playing at, which is hate and division and racism and
Mhm.
this complete annihilation type of approach.
Mhm.
What other things you can add to that and give tips to people as to how to approach, for example, very difficult conflicts and stay rational at the same time? Because many people find it difficult, even emotionally,
Mhm.
and feel like they're traumatized by even witnessing some of these things that we're seeing now
Mhm.
from Gaza.
One of the things that I've done is I've created alliances with Jews of conscience, right? I am definitely aiding and abetting them in their separation of Jewishness from Judaism, from Zionism. I think
Mm,
all three of those are different, and many of them are secular. People like Max Blumenthal and the Mates and
mm,
Abby Martin and Katie Halper, and they're all working to draw upon a tradition that has been subordinated within the Jewish lineage, that of tikkun ha'olam, and the notion of repairing the world, and the notion of what I call the Elohist tradition. Elohim were the divine council that created heaven and earth. Okay, and my theory is that a son of the Elohim, Yahweh, got promoted into the God position as a kind of warlike God, right? Very similar to Ares and very similar to Set,
mm,
within the Egyptian tradition. Okay, and that was done, I believe, retrospectively after the fall of the first temple in 586 BCE. And I thought the trauma is what created this anguish and desire for revenge and to strike back. And so this demigod, or son of the Elohim, of the creator, which I call the ruler, right, got elevated into the pantheon, and Asherah and all the women gods and got erased. And I know the Muslims have Aklima and Jamila as husband, as wives of Cain and Abel, and that got erased from the Bible even. So we saw an erasure of women. We saw an erasure of a creator God and a replacement of that with a ruler God. And that ruler God was a jealous God and a violent God and a vengeful God. And if you look at a good part of the Old Testament / Hebrew Bible, you're going to see, you obey me or you get punished. You obey me and you obey me and you get rewarded. Rewarded with immeasurable material things. You don't see a lot of passages about being rewarded with spiritual insight. And so now we are engaging a part of the Jewish tradition, which is going back to the first temple, which was more spiritual, right? More morally grounded. So one of the ways we can do that is beginning to ally with the Elohist or creator tradition, rather than, I think, the more Yahwist oriented ruler tradition, right? Which was more based on jealousy, on division and violence, whereas the other one was much more inclusive. And they are those traditions within Kabbalah as well. A lot more, having to do with how we are joined rather than how we are separated and against each other. So I think that that's one of the first things we can do. But I think also one of the things that I've been doing is looking into the Hebrew Bible. There is Kings 1 Kings 21 to look at cautionary tales. I'm now challenging the other side. I said, look, this has already been written in your own Bible. In that, it's Naboth's vineyard. Here you have Jezebel, okay, and Ahab. Ahab was an Israelite king. Now, this is totally ironic because early on, around 900 BCE, whatever, you had a split, right, between the northern kingdom, which was Israel, and the southern kingdom, which was Judah. And in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, the Judah was the one that retained the sacredness, the spirituality, and Israel was the one that had left it, right, was worshiping. And Ahab was an Israelite leader. Again, one of the bad leaders. There weren't apparently any of the really good leaders. And his wife was Jezebel. In this passage, 1 Kings 21, chapter 21, Ahab wanted Naboth's vineyard. It was a plum vineyard, okay? And Naboth said, no, I've inherited it from my family. I don't feel like I could give it over, even if I wanted to, basically. And he goes home and he's sobbing to his wife, Jezebel. And Jezebel says, I'll handle it. So what does Jezebel do? Jezebel says, I'm going to write out some letters with your seal on them and send them to the elders of the town that he is, so the city that he's, a part of. And I'm going to have them get together a celebration. And I'm going to have two guys set up where they're going to accuse him of insulting the king and insulting God. And then they'll use that as a pretext to stone them and then to take the vineyard. And I said, isn't that exactly what's happening right now in Palestine? You are using these really low, skeezy, evil methods to malign someone else as a pretext to kill them and take their land. Okay? And I said, there it is, right there. You are doing exactly this. But remember, the Israelites, which I find ironic since they named their entire thing Israel, were the ones, the northern kingdom, that was apostate, that had fallen away from God. So you're going to claim that name for you as you come back? Maybe they're ostensibly trying to say we're reassembling the lost tribes. But ironically, what they're saying, if you look at the Hebrew Bible, is you are the ones that are apostate and apart from God, and you admit it by aligning yourselves with the story in your own Bible that says you've fallen away. And you're doing the exact same thing that Ahab and Jezebel did in the Bible, and we know that's evil. This perfectly innocent person who is only preserving their family, lineage, and heritage and land that they've lived on for so long says, I will not give this up. And you say, I will kill you and take it. Right there, 1 Kings chapter 21. And that was written how many hundreds, thousands of years ago?
Exactly. And I mean, look, I highlighted previously the notion of obviously Israel really hijacking Judaism and Zionism using Judaism as a facade front for a neo-colonial supremacist project, really, nothing more than that. And they're not really the first group to use either religious slogans or religious banners to promote a political objective, right? They're not the first ones. And what about the Ten Commandments? Really? Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. You shall not covet. I mean, can you really call yourself Jewish yet go against the basic teachings of Judaism constantly, right? And not many people really focus on these things. The only thing that you do have when it comes to this is the labeling. Because in my opinion, even the term anti-Semitism, it's being weaponized, and the term itself It gained popularity and momentum in the beginning of the 20th century with the rise of Zionism. Why? Because Zionism wanted to ethnicize Judaism. They wanted to make Judaism an ethnicity. And by saying that you're anti Semite, you are basically against the land of the people of that ethnicity, which make you against the religion, which is a completely false notion.
Mm-hmm.
It's like me saying, if you criticize Saudi Arabia, you're against Islam. I know Saudi Arabia holds the most sacred places, for example, in Islam. However, criticizing it as a political entity is a criticism for a political entity. It has nothing to do with the religion itself. Yet, the mainstream media and politicians are on such a intense campaign, really, to demonize and label everyone as anti-Semitic, really. And I think it's been used primarily to instill fear in people and preventing them from questioning or giving very valid criticism. The final thing I wanted to talk to you about, Zeus, before we wrap up, is on your website. I notice that in one point you spoke about activism, in which you stated deinstitutionalized learning, providing grassroots democratic access to its power, especially among marginalized learners and learning environments, home schools, charter schools, learning disabled, creative, gifted, and non-conventional learners. And I also saw some criticism from you, although you're a PhD, about the titles, really, when it comes to studying. Can you elaborate a little bit more that and your vision to share it with us?
Yeah, I put PhD. I even put it down in the descriptor here just to let people know that I have a certain amount of background and a savviness as to the institutional nature of things. I'm not an outsider. But the whole point of using the tools of power provided by institutions, including getting a doctoral degree, is to upend or unearth or invert the system that gave rise to this kind of caste system stacked up this way. Now I have, because I've spoken out, I've spoken from the grassroots in support against vaccine mandates and in support of individual choice around things like that. I've spoken out, with regard to, when it was unpopular with regard to gay marriage. And then I've also challenged things like, medicalization of children and having them be medically, altered or, with regard to this gender identity. And so I have been thrown out of any of the identity groups because I don't follow along a particular line. Right. I seem conservative when it comes to the gender, medicalization of children. I seem maybe conservative when it comes to the vaccines. And now with Palestine, the conservatives, including the somewhat conservative church that I visit, kind of looks at me a little suspiciously. So for me, there is truth in all of this. And for me, I'm trying to develop the tools through my Substack. There's two different ones, Spiritually Confident and Citizen Zeus. I've kind of let my own website go a little bit. I've kind of transferred a lot of my material over to Substack, and both of those is to help people develop tools to discern when you're presented two losing options, right? You look at any one of these debates, right? And they're trying to channel you into two hopeless and powerless positions, right? Even the term misinformation and disinformation means telling falsehoods, official lies becomes true information, and calling unofficial truths becomes misinformation. So what I'm trying to help people do is cultivate confidence, both spiritual confidence, but also moral and intellectual confidence and competence, to challenge these inversions and to challenge these divisions, which no matter what choice you make, you're going to lose. Like if I choose neoliberalism or I choose neoconservatism, I'm going to lose. So I've always tried to help people develop tools to go from the grassroots up. And an example of this is going across ideological lines. I went and teamed as a progressive with a very conservative group called Moms for Liberty to get masks out of my kids' school when I was living back in
Mm.
California. So we have got to understand that the real new realignment here is bottom up versus top down, as you already
Mm.
alluded to. We got to develop, we got to smash through all the divisions, right, that the adversary is placing between us on the bottom. That means concentrating on working class across racial lines. That means concentrating on moral and spiritual virtue across religious lines and doctrinal lines, right? Going across gender lines, not letting, men, women, other genders stand in the way or be the primary thing, to say, listen, what we all are fighting for is that we can freely express and develop ourselves, without imposing it upon someone else. So that's really the secret. The learning I'm talking about is a critical engagement with a world that's made us set up to be powerless and to lose no matter what choice we make.
Mm.
Pierce through that, see what their motivations are, see the technology and the propaganda. So become critically aware, but then creatively engaged, creatively and socially and virtuously engaged with one another, and not let those identity tropes and the traumas and the fears that are continually being pounded at us and the manipulations through algorithms and social media prevent us from coming together and becoming a higher, more virtuous, more spiritually powerful and socially well organized. And we've got to do that not just in our imagination. Younger kids today, one of the greatest disabilities they have is that they believe, and they've been taught, that if it happens in their mind, then it happens in the world.
Mm.
So I'm reteaching them how to organize, over real issues. It happened in Parkland. You had these high school students that organized around gun safety down there, and they were able to successfully actually pass actual policy. And I think you've focused on this too. Enough of the rhetoric. Where's the policy?
Mm.
So another part of that is political education. Let's make sure certain policies happen. And now in Ohio, where I live right now, we did have that policy. I mean, it's not, it had something protecting the right to choose here, because the state had come from the top down and imposed a ban. And they even had marijuana is now liberalized here in Ohio, and it's a fairly conservative state. So what we're seeing is effective movement in the direction of policy across these different lines. And I'm doing everything I can on the educational level to make school more relevant. In fact, I'm thinking about maybe even starting a school in which spirituality, critical thinking, and these things become the core of it. Financial literacy and a social justice, real social justice, not imaginary symbolic social justice, but the real thing, become the core of the school, as well as artistic and creative development as well.
Brilliant.
So
I'm sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
And again, I'm only one person, and right now I'm really just focused on trying to understand spirituality in a different way. That's non-religious, that's helpful and practical, and help people develop the courage and awareness to develop a different pathway than one determined by a system that's going to make sure you lose and they win.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think if you'd go ahead with the school idea, that would be great, really. And many people will benefit from that, because I think we need this mentality of, approach that's not very traditional of schooling, right? Even the name of school, where you're indoctrinated more than educated. You're taught how to be a number, not the creator, not an entrepreneur, really. But it's very important. And on that note, Dr. Zeus Yiamouyiannis, thank you so much for joining us. And we need to do this again at some point.
Oh, definitely. I love your show, Mahmoud. I love your intelligence. That's what
Thank you.
actually got me to reach out to you. So I'm glad I'd be more than willing to do it again.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll definitely meet up again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Thank you very much, guys, for joining in. That's Dr. Zeus Yiamouyiannis, and we'll see you in the next modcast.